Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. So how are you, Ken?
I'm grateful to be here, Rory, and we're so delighted that you've joined us for episode 162 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. 3 sections today, starting off with a student check-in where we look at something that would be relevant for students. And today we're going to be speaking about being sent for counselling. Now, we kind of learn at level 2, early stages in counselling, that clients shouldn't really be sent for counselling. Yet, as a student of counselling, there is a part of your course where you have to go and get some counselling. So we're going to look at that from a student perspective in just a moment. Our centre section today, the Counselling Digital Revolution, where we look at how counselling is moving online and the tools and techniques we might use. We're going to be looking into managing the disinhibition effect within your practice. So what does that look like and how might you work with that? And if you don't know what that is, you're in for a treat on that. And then in Practice Matters, where we dip our toe into that our qualified practitioners might come across in practice, we're looking at how we might work with clients who are on certain kinds of medication. But let's kick off with our student check-in, being sent for counselling from a student's perspective, and maybe feeling, Rory, that you don't know if you've got anything to take to counselling, but the course says you've got to go. What do we do?
Yeah, well, in most practice-based courses, so that would be UK, or should I say England level 4 and above, our friends in Scotland, it would be diploma and above, would be asked, and indeed in Wales, it would be level 4 and above. I've got to be so careful now because the different regions have different qualification bases, and we get letters in the...
carefully, Mr.
Yeah,
Lees-Oakes.
carefully here. We get letters in the post bag. But if you're on a practice-based course, see what I did there? If you're on a practice-based course, almost certainly you'll be asked to have your own personal therapy. And right from level 2, of course, the teaching is you cannot send someone for therapy. And then when you get into your practice-based years, your tutor says you've got to have your own personal therapy. And rightly so, students say, well, hang on a second. We've been told for the last 2.5 years that you can't be sent for therapy, and you're doing exactly that. It feels, at the very least, a little bit incongruent. And I would say that I would agree, to be honest. I would agree that it does feel incongruent if it's framed in a you must go for therapy way. I think it's the way it's framed. If you say to someone you need to go for therapy, the immediate thought is either, I must have something wrong with me, or I don't really want to go. So you get resistance. And I think that if it's framed in a way where you say you're experiencing what it's like to have therapy, and also it's a really good safety valve for you doing a practice-based course, because there's so many different elements to doing a course. I can't think that there'd be anybody who wouldn't have anything to discuss in a therapist's office about the personal growth changes, how they're managing to juggle everything around, the dynamics of the group. There is just such a rich seam to mine, I think, for personal therapy if you're in practice. But you don't have to have something, inverted commas, I'm doing an inverted air comma here, wrong with you. I think it is just literally a case of getting a chance to process the great changes that are going on in a really neutral and safe space.
Yeah. I think about a driving instructor when we speak about this. You would expect that a driving instructor wouldn't just go on a course to learn how to sit next to someone and tell them how to drive. You would expect that at some stage they might have sat behind the wheel and given it a bash themselves, this driving thing. And I guess as counsellors, as psychotherapists, if we're going to be there for clients in a therapeutic way, then an important factor is that we've experienced what it's like to be in a therapeutic relationship with somebody being there for us. So I think that you're 100% right, Rory. I mean, we hear in those early years of counselling study, you can't send a client for counselling. And that is 100% correct. It's in fact unethical to do so, to say to someone, you need to go for counselling. And when you were mentioning what might come up in students, one of the things you mentioned there is, if I'm being sent for counselling, there must be something wrong with me. And I think it starts with this. It starts with, what is your mindset as a a training counselor, training a psychotherapist towards therapy. Now, for me, I've been in practice for some years now, and counseling is less about people coming in because there is something wrong with them, and more about people coming in because they choose to develop and grow their lives in certain areas. And if you go into your personal therapy, which is mandated, it's not recommended, Rory, it's mandated on so many courses, as Rory outlined, it is an opportunity to grow. Now, there are certain thoughts about this. Some students think that it's about going in to see how another counsellor works, to sit there and almost give a crit or a study or go, is that how it's done? And I would advise, when you're going into your own therapy, to put that aside and go in without any expectations, without any kind of judging or linking what you're seeing how you see the therapist practice to your course, and more about, how am I feeling as a client in this? How am I growing? How am I benefiting within that relationship? And in terms of when you go for that therapy, there's another one of my thoughts that I shared with my students while lecturing alongside Rory, is you're kind of given the option usually to do it within a two-year window. You start your level 4, which is 2 years, or your practice-based part of your course, which is going to be around 2 years, and you're asked that within those 2 years you should go in and do your personal therapy. And my suggestion is, it's sometimes an idea to wait until you get client-facing, until you're in practice. And the reason for this is, when you're client-facing and you're in practice and you're going to supervision with client presentations, chances are something might come up where a client says something that reminds you of something from your own past, or something that you can relate to. And it is during those practice years, when you're kind of client-facing, that things can come up, and it's really beneficial then to take that to therapy, grow as a person from that.
Yeah, and it's a real unique opportunity as well, because you can go and sit in front of someone who's non-judgmental, who can and explain where your life is. I recently had some therapy, and as a lot of therapists do now, they did a scorecard, an assessment. I think it was a core assessment. And my therapist said to me, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with you. And I said, well, there isn't. I said, I'm here just to explore certain aspects of my life and make sense of them in a safe surrounding. And I had a number of sessions with my therapist, and I thought it was really, really beneficial. It was a place I could go where maybe I couldn't do that in any other arena of my life. And when she did the final assessment at the end, she said, it's not changed. You're still on the higher levels. You're still a happy man. And I said, well, I am. I just wanted a space to explore issues and processes in my life and to try and make sense of them. I wasn't unwell, and I wasn't troubled. I just needed to get some clarity. And I thought the whole process was incredibly useful. And I'd like to thank the poster on our Facebook page who posed this question about being, inverted commas, sent for therapy. And if you don't know our Facebook pages, if you go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find us. We're a closed group. Just knock on the door. And of course, we're going to let you in, and you'll meet thousands of like-minded students. We've got practitioners, we've got supervisors, we've got a smattering of tutors in there, all interested in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. But I do think that own personal therapy is a unique opportunity. And here's what I know from 10 years of teaching at practice level, Ken, is that students always used to say, I've got nothing to take. And when they get there, they find they've got a whole lot of stuff that just unpacks.
Yeah, it reminds me of the personal development exercise called Johari's window. We only know what we know. Some of that's going on for us is unseen to us. And by going into therapy, we get the gift of that maybe coming into view. So I agree with you wholeheartedly there, Rory. And, it depends on what kind of course you're on as well. Because if you're doing a transactional analysis course, well, it's a whole different level. You're going to be in therapy not just during your studies, but throughout your your professional practice. And I think there's merit to that as well. You just mentioned, Roy, I mean, you've been in practice for many, many years now. I've been in practice for many years now, and I've dipped into therapy a number of times during that time when I recognize something comes up for me in my life. Rather than wrestling with that and fighting off those demons, now I'm doing the inverted commas as well, Rory. I take it along to therapy because I know therapy is beneficial for me. And just like you say, Rory, it's a professionally held space where you can kind of bring stuff and confidentiality. There's no other aspects of my life, certainly, where I can do that. I can speak to my wife. I can chat to her. But she has a vested interest in me, in our relationship. She knows our past. She knows our future plans. So she can't be unbiased in that, whereas a therapist can. And I've definitely found that really useful. And as said, there are certain modalities where you are expected to be in continuous therapy to grow and help better help, I guess, your clients. Yeah,
absolutely. I think in TA and it's 60 hours, and I think if you're doing a psychoanalytical dynamic course, if you're studying Jungian psychoanalytical psychology. I heard on the radio the other day that someone was in therapy twice a week for 10 years.
Yep.
So, it can vary. But yeah, it is an interesting thing, but I think it's really useful. And if you are listening to this, you're thinking, that's me, I'm that person who's being asked to go, go with an open mind and an open heart. And you may find that the process of it unlocks processes within you that you can really get a good sense about and understand about. We all carry bits from our past. It's part of being human, and sometimes just having that really lovely space, as happened with my therapist, just to unpack and just to look at aspects and as you say, Ken, not have someone with a vested interest, just someone neutral, just to kind of reflect to you and maybe a little challenge you a little bit. I think is great. I found the whole experience really, really fulfilling.
Agreed. And there's another win in this for you as a student as well, in that part of your final work to graduate and become a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist is a piece of work you're going to do on your own personal development, how you've developed since you started the training to where you are now and what that's been about. And going for your own personal therapy is a rich seam for that. So it kind of, if you journal well during your therapy sessions, it kind of your personal development assignment kind of writes itself. So it's assignment help by going for your personal therapy. Hopefully that has kind of cleared something up on that and answered the question, but it remains a topic of discussion. I mean, I know, Rory, that some students have reported that they go for their own personal therapy and find it really disappointing. And I think that this is a conversation we need to continuously have. Great place to do that is, as Rory said, our Facebook page. Jump on Facebook, Counselling Tutor, get in that group and join these conversations. The topics of this podcast certainly come from there. And that is our student check-in. I could not leave student check-in without saying to our students, if you were on a formal training course, specifically in the UK, we do have a bank of resources mapped to the UK awarding body's criteria to help you out. Recorded lectures that you can revisit on the very topics that you cover on your course. And if you're interested in finding more about that, that's our paid for service called Counselling Study Resource, or CSR. You just go to counsellingtutor.com and all the information is there. But as we leave the student check-in and we kind of move to what is new, what is happening now, we enter the Counselling Digital Revolution.
Digital Counselling Revolution.
Now that a lot of therapists are working online, we're being introduced to new theories. There are lots of different theories when you work online, be it on the telephone or across a video platform with clients. And one very interesting work is the work of John Suler, and it's called Disinhibition Effect. I know we've all heard the term keyboard warrior, where some anonymous person writes horrible things in Facebook or on social media or on newspaper sites. Well, what that actually is disinhibition. It's the idea that because someone isn't known, can't be seen, the normal rules of societal engagement, politeness, if you like, or at least respect for the other person, can slide away a little bit. And this can be quite present in online work, especially in telephone counselling, because there is an anonymity with telephone counselling. If you think about it, you don't know what your client looks like or their circumstances. They don't know you. And it's really interesting that when you work on the phone, it may be that boundaries start to slide in terms of the client's position. Maybe that we've had reports of people meeting a client on the telephone to find they're in bed, or they're in a car driving along with somebody. And this is disinhibition. It's the theory that when we're not kind of seen in the world or known, that we may just become more anonymous. And part of that theory talks about not really using boundaries appropriately, and also a disrespect for authority, which kind of links into things like contracting, agreed contracts and things like that. And it's something really, really to look out for. And if you look on social media sites or anywhere where people can write anonymously, you would probably see some quite horrible things written. Actually, if you met the people in person, they're probably quite nice people. It's the disinhibition, the idea that they're not accountable, that gives them this kind of sense of, I'm going to use the word freedom loosely, to kind of say things that they wouldn't usually say face to face. It's a well-known phenomenon, isn't it, Ken?
It is indeed. John Suler, 2004, he wrote a paper, The Online Disinhibition Effect. And if you want more information on that, go to counsellingtutor.com. On our main website, we have a great article on disinhibition effect. Exactly as you said, Rory. It's kind of as we look at moving counselling and psychotherapy to using more digital technologies, even if that's just email, text-based, telephone, video, whatever it is. As soon as you're putting the filter of technology between you and your client, then there are different things that we need to understand and know about. And one of them is this disinhibition effect. As you've beautifully outlined what that is, Rory, it's kind of, I'm behind my screen over here. Nobody can see me. Nobody really knows who I am. I can be an expert in any subject. I can be really brave and strong. And this is, there's a rise in something called cyberbullying from children that wouldn't in person exhibit those kind of behaviors. But as soon as it's over the phone or on a tablet and the person is distanced, there is that disinhibition effect that kicks in. And one of the areas where we see it really plainly is in dating apps. And I'm not going to name any dating apps. There's loads of them out there. But there's kind of a swipe right and a swipe left. Now I don't do the dating app, so I don't even know which way is which. And I think right is yes, that person looks okay to me, and left is no, that person's not for me. But if you think about what's happening there, you're looking at a picture and a very short blurb of a profile of somebody and going, yes, that one, no, not that one, yes, that one, no, not that one. And I wonder how that would change if all of those people were standing in a line in front of the person and walking up to them in person. I wonder if they would be so easily swiped left and right. And that is an example of disinhibition. I can certainly see it in myself. I can see disinhibition when I'm working online, and I can certainly see it in others. But the important thing here is we are counselors, psychotherapists. How might this impact the counseling relationship? And I think that's the crux of it. What might we look out for? How might we see it, identify it, and kind of work with that?
Absolutely. And so far, Ken, we've talked about clients, but disinhibition effect is a two-way street. It can actually impact on therapists. And that is why it's so important to have a supervisor who understands the online world, because nobody is immune from it. This is the whole point. No one is immune from disinhibition. It's a process of disconnection because you're not sat in front or stood in front of somebody. So as a therapist, that can happen. And, a good supervisor, someone who's done a course on online and telephone counselling, would be able to recognise that if that came up. And it could be just something as simple as a therapist saying, "Oh well, I was sat in my front room talking to my client," and the supervisor may say, "Well, usually you have a study or an office space for client work? Yes, well, but they don't know that I'm in my front room or in my kitchen.
Aha.
And
There it is.
There it is. And I know from my supervisory experience that it's easy to see. And if you're on the phone, of course, nobody knows where you are. Unless you're on a video phone where you're playing the video, but if it's just voice only. And I think that disinhibition can really impact on practitioners as well. So I think my observation there would be to just think about how you are when you use the phone and not doing other things as well. If you're on the phone, people may be doing other things. They may be, cooking or something like that. And it takes away from the psychological process of being connected. If you're working with a client and you say, oh, what's that in the background? Oh, I'm just cooking my lunch. How invested are they? How much psychological contact is there? It's a theory, I think, that anybody who works online needs to really understand and process themselves.
100%. I mean, you're speaking about disinhibition from our perspective as a counsellor there, Rory, and you've given a great example of where you might catch yourself or where a supervisor might pick that up. Other areas where you may catch disinhibition in self when working with a client as the counsellor is when you find yourself maybe giving advice or guidance out of the norm that you might do in a face-to-face situation where you're suddenly an expert in something, telling people what to do. And it's easy to slip into it. It's a tricky little trap, is disinhibition. That's why it's about studying it, understanding it, knowing it, and as you say, Rory, being able to take stuff to supervision and working with a supervisor who can spot that from in you as the counsellor. And then when we kind of look at what we might see in clients and how disinhibition can be damaging to our therapeutic relationship. Because of disinhibition, a client may disclose too quickly. So if you think about a face-to-face counselling relationship, generally the client would come in and maybe give some of the narrative, but there is a building of trust throughout the sessions before a client may go, you know what, I've never told anybody this, but, and then maybe bring out some information. And they're doing that within a trusting, held relationship where they know the counsellor, they're feeling that unconditional positive regard. They're not going to be judged. They know that they're being understood empathically, and they therefore maybe feel safe enough to unwrap and bring out this pain that they might have been carrying for some time. Now, when we go online, we can see that happening prematurely, perhaps even in the beginning of the first session, because we're told to get better, we need to get things off our chest, Rory. That's the way you do. You've got to get off your chest that. Oh, you know what you want to do? You want to go and talk to somebody about that. Face to face, the trust needs to build first because we are naturally inhibited. Online, without that inhibition, the disinhibition effect kicks in, and we can find a client delving into that material quickly without them feeling the empathic side of the relationship, feeling that they're not being judged. And it can be quite liberating. Here's the thing, it can be quite liberating for that client that gets online and says all these things, but how do they feel afterwards? And to be able to kind of think about this, think about a time in your life when you were in a situation, you were maybe feeling disinhibited, maybe after a few drinks or in a relaxed state, where you say something, you give out some information of yours that is quite private, that you wouldn't normally give out, and in the moment it feels fine. But the next morning you kind of, I wish I hadn't said, what do they think now? And and that is the result that we do not want for our clients. We don't want them prematurely disclosing without the safety of the relationship and feeling safe to do so. So we watch out for disinhibition, and we kind of try to pace our clients. If they're bringing something out too early in the session, to kind of close them down, recognize that you have something really important to bring, but maybe just kind of distancing slightly from that while you build the relationship. Because you can build trust, you can build a great empathic relationship online, but we got to watch out for the trap, the disinhibition effect.
Absolutely. And you make a really good point. I think a lot of people listening to this will recognize the too much too soon situation, maybe in vino veritas, as they used to say, in wine truth. And what it tends to happen with that is that, of course, clients then feel maybe embarrassed or shamed and then don't engage in therapy. They have maybe one session, they release all this information, they feel bad about it, and then they don't continue therapy, which, is up to them ultimately, but may disadvantage them. So I think it's really worth thinking about when you're working with a client, as Ken said, to pace it, and maybe to voice it, maybe to say to a client, sometimes working on the phone, people say they feel they've said too much, and just bring that into awareness. So I think it's an interesting theory, and as Ken has rightly said, I think anybody who practices online really, really needs to understand it, especially if you're working on the phone, because they can't see you, and of course you can't see them.
Definitely. And we've got a free handout on the disinhibition effect in counselling. And to get that, you just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcasts tab. You're listening to a podcast right now. It's going to give you our back catalogue of got to watch how I speak there, Rory, going too fast, of podcasts. You're looking for episode 162. On that page, you'll find all of the show notes from today's episode, including the link to the article on the disinhibition effect, and there is a download from that page where you can kind of just get an overview, keep that on hand, and just remind ourselves, specifically if you're working online or using any digital medium. So that is the digital revolution, and we're going to kind of back out of the digital revolution into what we call practice matters, where we tip our toe into that we come across in our practice as qualified therapists. So without any further ado, let's jump into practice matters.
Practice matters.
One of the, I think, interesting parts of practice nowadays is working with clients who may be on medication. The amounts of antidepressants that are being prescribed at the moment are at an all-time high. And when we're working with clients on antidepressant medication or anxiety medication, any form of medication, we have to be very, very thoughtful. And I was thinking the other day about the very first of the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions that Carl Rogers talked about, and that was psychological contact. He believed that you couldn't have any kind of growth or any kind of understanding if someone wasn't in psychological contact. And I think practitioners need to be aware that if they're working with someone who's just recently gone onto medication, that their thought processes may very well be altered for a slight time. They may be a bit fuzzy in their mind. Lots of antidepressants, especially SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, easy for me to say, Ken, can sometimes take a couple of weeks before people settle into them. And certainly when using other drugs like diazepam, it's not really prescribed a lot now for anxiety, but it still can do. People can become disconnected. So if someone is on prescribed medication, you really, really need to be thoughtful when working with them. And also, I think it's really important that if you have a client who is saying that their medication isn't working, that you don't go down the road, and I'm sure no one would, of being a doctor. I think the best way of working with that, if someone says, I'm feeling really awful on this medication, I'm fuzzy-headed, I can't think, I don't know where I am, is to say maybe you should go and see a doctor and have a medication review. Because that's what happens, if you're using any kind of medication for anxiety or depression, or maybe if you've got something for disassociation, I'm going to use the word schizophrenia. There are medications for that, things like olanzapine, but they can have side effects, and in the initial stages of them, they can really give people a disconnection. And I think that therapists need to be aware of that and monitor it in their own practice. It may be that someone comes to you, they've just started on meds, and they're really disconnected. And through the weeks, as they kind of settle into them, they become a little bit more connected. But I think modern practitioners really, really need to understand this.
Definitely. And, we speak about assessment from time to time and the importance of assessment when a client enters therapy. And here's another example of why assessment is important. One of the questions may be, are you on any medication at the moment? And what is that medication that you might be on? And it gives us, I guess, an opportunity as therapists to look up what are the effects of that medication. Now, it doesn't mean that if anybody comes to counselling on medication, then they can't go into counselling, or that the counselling wouldn't be as effective. That's not what we're saying at all. It's about having an understanding. We're acting in service of the client, and we need to understand where they are coming from, and maybe understand if there are any areas that we kind of need to be aware of. For instance, as you've said, Rory, if you're new on medication, specifically certain medications can take many months, if not years, to get the medication balance right for certain presentations. And a person can go through different mood swings. They can go through little bouts of depression that are chemically induced from the medications that they might be taking. And it's about knowing, researching, and understanding so we can work in service of the clients. And you spoke about SSRIs, Rory, handed out like Smarties. I don't know if they still are to this very day, but they certainly were just a few years ago. It was, I think, one of the most prescribed drugs in the United Kingdom. And that it's a really effective medication, and that's why it is prescribed, and that's why it's done so well. But what it can do is it can kind of deaden feelings. And even after prolonged use, it can really reduce the amount of feelings that a person feels, their emotions. It suppresses emotions. You go in because you're struggling with your emotions. The medical profession might give you a prescription. Here's a tablet that is going to suppress those emotions. Where, of course, in counseling, to be effective, we're looking at emotions. We want to work with the emotion. We don't want to work so much with the story. We want to go under the story, under the words of the music, to the actual music itself, which is the feelings and the emotions that the person is experiencing. And if those are suppressed in some way, we just need to know about it. It doesn't mean you can't work with the client, but it's good to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And, let's be clear here. SSRIs and other medications to help with anxiety are very helpful to people. Maybe people listening to this are on a prescription who are finding them very, very helpful. But from a practitioner's point of view, we just need to be aware if our client is in psychological contact. I know I've had experience of meeting people, not particularly clients, who just use some medication and they're just disconnected. They're disconnected. And if you have someone who's disconnected in your therapy room and they're not here, you're not present in an equal and present time, I think you have an ethical decision to make about, can you proceed with therapy? How do you support that client? And I think it's really essential that any practicing therapist has a reasonably good understanding of the different medications that are out there and what they do. And you can find that, you can look on the web, and there's lots of information about different medications and what they're actually doing. I'd like to make one other point as well. There's always been a debate in counselling. It's usually framed, when I started, as pills, not skills. And the idea that either therapy is totally effective or medication is totally effective, and there's no middle ground. I know some people who have very traumatic pasts who use medications to reduce anxiety because effectively their brain has been so traumatized that it doesn't function in the same way as a non-traumatized brain. And to help them stabilize, they use drugs to help the part of the brain, mainly the amygdala, that little fire alarm that we have in those two little almond-shaped pieces of cells that are fire alarm of the brain, to help regulate it. And I think that if someone comes to you and they are on medication for that, not to think that the counselling is going to take that over, that the counselling will stop them using medication. The facts are, it may be that it's a blended economy. There may be some medication, there may be some therapy, and it may be an ongoing encounter with both of them. And I have come across some therapists who've said, oh, medication, no good at all. All he needs therapy. And I've come across some people who said, you don't need therapy, all he needs medication.
Yeah.
I think the wise therapist, the thoughtful therapist, is someone who understands that this is very much about the individual client, how they're experiencing the world, how their well-being in the world is, and how that is a blended mix of maybe a little bit of medical model, but using medication and a little bit of counselling.
Agreed. And there is research available specifically with SSRIs. And I think if I don't remember the research in detail, so it's worth maybe going on online and kind of looking it up. But I think that the research was done between SSRIs alone, talking therapy alone, and a combination of SSRIs and talking therapies. And if I remember correctly, I think the combination actually came up as a winner there. But I could stand corrected, and you need to go and have a look at that. But there is research available. I think that's what's important. And just to echo what Rory has said, we're not here giving any advice on this. We're not saying you should or you shouldn't. We're saying nothing more than educate yourself, do your CPD that is required, and maybe consider on entry, when a client is entering, that during your assessment, you might ask about medications just to have that understanding to work in service of the client. And of course, if you're interested in CPD, we've got our CPD library. You can get more information on that by going to counsellingtutor.com. It's for qualified practitioners only. And Rory actually did write a pretty comprehensive book on pharmacology, I think it was, Rory. Not as a pharmacologist, though. Just Rory did some research on the different medications, what their names are, what the generic names are of the different medications, and kind of what the effects are. Are they do they lift mood? Do they depress mood? It's quite an interesting book, and that is in our CPD library. Counsellingtutor.com. That's where all that information is available.
Well, what an interesting podcast today, if I do say so myself, and I am saying so myself. We talked about being sent for counselling and responded to comments in our Facebook group about students on their journey to become qualified practitioners, and part of that is having their own therapy. We talked about a real and live psychological theory for those of you who are working online and especially on the phone. We talked about the Disinhibition Effect and a super handout for that. And finally, we talked about working with clients on medication, supporting our clients who may be using medication to help them with specific issues while using counselling to help process the emotional issues that are going on for them. And as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and join the digital revolution.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.